Hello to all our viewers and listeners. My name is Danielle Flint, and today, with my classmate Diego Vargas, we will present our proposal for applying the knowledge transforming model to L2 learners. We are students from Pontificia, Universidad Católica de Valparaíso, and as EFL teachers in training, it is pivotal to understand the elements involved in writing composition. Models, as the ones proposed by Bereiter and Scardamalia, attempt to explain how knowledge is brought into the writing process and what happens to this knowledge in the process. They are built on the work of the original planning, writing, review, and framework established by Flower and Hayes that sees writing as a nonlinear, exploratory, and generative process, whereby writers discover and reformulate their ideas as they attempt to approximate meaning, as well as on Bitzer's idea in regard that speech always occurs as a response to a rhetorical situation, which he succinctly defines as containing an exigency which demands a response, and an audience, and a set of constraints. And last, on Roman's idea of pre-writing. Since these were all designed for L1 writers, they lack in addressing some particularities that L2 writers face. This creates a need for EFL teachers to modify and adapt the existing models into a contextualized ones. Thus, for instructional purposes, it is relevant to characterize these adaptations in correlation with the phases of the existing models. The aim of this presentation is to provide justifications that explain how the modifications proposed interact with Bereiter and Scardamalia's knowledge transforming model and affect the writing process stages. To continue, here's a brief scope of what we are going to be seeing in this presentation. First, a theoretical framework is provided in order to describe the concepts of major relevance. Secondly, Bereiter and Scardamalia's models are explained, with emphasis in the knowledge transforming model, which includes its composing and cognitive processes. Thirdly, reason and justification are provided in order to explain what and why we chose our model as a starting point, and which modifications were made for proposing our own model that accounts for L2 writers' particularities. Later, Matsuda and Hyland's perspectives are presented in order to provide concepts to consider for modifying the chosen starting point model. Finally, a summary of the main points and reflections is developed to conclude.
The first part of our development is the theoretical framework. In this section, we are going to explain the main points of Flower and Hayes and Bereiter and Scardamalia models in order to explain why we choose the knowledge transforming model as a starting point. In the same way, we are going to explain the main aspects regarding Matsuda's dynamic model and Highland factors that affect specifically to second language writers.
Here, you can see a cognitive process theory of writing. This model of writing processes is the one most widely accepted by L2 writing teachers and is the original planning, writing, reviewing framework and is established by Flowers and Hayes. This sees writing, as said by Zamel, as a nonlinear, exploratory, and generative process whereby writers discover and reformulate their ideas as they attempt to approximate meaning. The process of planning, drafting, revisiting, and editing do not occur in a neat linear sequence, but are recursive, interactive, and potentially simultaneous. All work can be reviewed, evaluated, and revised, even before any text has been produced at all. At any point, the writer can jump backward or forward to any of these activities. This basic model of writing has been elaborated with the purpose of furthering the description of what goes on at each stage of the writing process and to integrate cognitive with social factors more smoothly.
Building on Flower and Hayes' work, Bereiter and Scardamalia have proposed that we need at least two process models to account for the differences in processing complexity of mature versus immature writers. They label this as knowledge telling and knowledge transforming models. The knowledge telling model centers around the fact that immature writers plan less than experts, revise less, reevaluate less often and less extensively, have minimum goals, and are mainly concerned with generating content. The knowledge transforming model shows how skilled writers use the writing composing task to analyze problems, reflect on the task, and set goals and aims to actively revise, reevaluate thoughts to change both their text and ideas. The main aspects in regard to knowledge-telling model are, for the purposes of this presentation, that their main components include a mental representation of the assignment and the cognitive component of long-term memory. Then, after the retrieve of content from memory, the writer evaluates pertinence regarding the topic or in terms of persuasion, for example, depending on the task. On the other hand, knowledge transforming model includes more cognitive components such as problem solving. It is recursive there is a bidirectional relationship among their parts, they affect each other, and take into account rhetorical macro level top down processes regarding prior knowledge, and not only micro level bottom down processes such as grammatical competence for linguistic structures, but discourse competence, especially in regard to the dialectic interplay of both spaces. Both models are seen as poles of a continuum where writing expertise moves in stages, in a nonlinear incremental development and implies cognitive transformations. In terms of instructional purposes, for writing teachers, the model helps explain the difficulties their L2 writers sometimes face because of task complexity and lack of topic knowledge. Its emphasis on revising, reevaluating, and reflective thought also stresses the need for students to participate in a diverse range of cognitively challenging writing tasks in order to develop their abilities, and the importance of feedback and revision in the process of transforming both content and expression, promoting cognitive processes as metacognition. Relevant for this presentation is the model proposed by Matsuda. He develops a model of L2 writing that enriched teaching from contrastive rhetoric studies, a field that centers around how organization of a text depends on cultural background, especially in L2 writers whose linguistic and rhetorical conventions of the mother tongue interfere with the writing of the second language. He presents as a starting point a static model that establishes that the decisions about the organization may be influenced by the writer's cultural, linguistic, or educational background, but these three are not the determining factors. The organization of the text reflects the complexity of the cognitive process of decision making that writers go through as they respond to their own another cognitive process as perception of the particular context of writing. The main assumptions of this model are that the writer is seen as a writing machine that reproduces what language, cultural, or educational background dictate, and it does not consider other factors such as the writer's past experience with the genre or with a particular discourse community, socioeconomic, or religious affiliation. Moreover, writers and readers' backgrounds are static entities, and the ESL writer is considered an external element of the context of reading. These are precisely the main features the dynamic model actually attempts to cover: writers' and readers' dynamic and diverse backgrounds, a shared discourse community, and the interaction of the elements of L2 writing within a dynamic context. The writer's decisions may also be influenced by native or non-native readers' expectations, his or her prior knowledge of the subject matter, past interactions within the reader, and he his or her membership to diverse L1 and L2 discourse communities. Backgrounds are complex and flexible and vary individually and chronologically. And a shared discourse community is a key concept that defines the space that surrounds the text, which is the intersection, the overlap between the background of the reader and the writer. It's a broadly agreed set of common public goals. On the other hand, relevant are the factors proposed by Highland, which are specific for L2 writing composing process. He posits that L2 writing is strategically, rhetorically, and linguistically different in important ways from L1 writing. Second language writers are distinguished by their bilingual and bicultural backgrounds, and particularly their prior experiences as writers and learners. There are numerous individual variables that can intervene to influence their acquisition of L2 writing skills. However, culture is too intimately bound up with language, rhetorical styles, learning preferences, and understandings of knowledge, text, and identity to simply ignore when considering writing instruction. His main points are that individual differences influence how students learn, how they respond to instruction, and the progress they make to improve their writing. And L2 writers are unique because of their bilingual and biliterate experiences, and this can facilitate or impede writing in various ways. Moreover, L2 learners may have different conceptions of knowledge, self, and text, which conflict with teachers' instructional practices and judgments of writing quality. Both teachers and students have preferred learning styles which are partly shaped by cultural experiences and which may conflict with each other and hinder progress in learning to write. L2 learners also uh, L2 learners' cultural schemata can impact on the ways they write and the writing they produce. So, Effective L2 writing instruction can make schematic differences explicit to students, encouraging consideration of audience and providing patterns of unfamiliar rhetorical forms.
Now, we will answer the following questions. Why did we choose the knowledge transforming model over the knowledge telling model? And why didn't we use the Flowers and Hayes model to explain L2? Well, Flowers and Hayes' representation sheds light on the cognitive nature of writing, but it also lacks to mention how rhetorical problems may affect composition. The telling model is centered on immature writers, so it is less effective to explain how rhetorical contexts affect writing composition regarding the prominence of cultural backgrounds as one of the main factors that differentiate L2 writers from native ones. The knowledge transforming representation provided by Pereira and Scardamalia show us the impact of not being able to fully use rhetorical and content problem-solving abilities, thus leading us into not only a better understanding of the mental procedures related to composing a text and the differences between immature and mature writers, but also a better chance to fit and complete the niche for developing the ideas regarding the interaction between writers and readers, backgrounds, or their shared discourse community, and the specific particularities of L2 writers. As previously mentioned, we have decided to focus on Pereira and Scardamalia's model of knowledge transforming because we consider that it is more accurate in terms of how teachers must focus their ways of teaching L2. Its instructional purpose is fundamental. Even though there can be differences in language proficiency in the L2, the mental process of constant reelaboration and analysis is constant for second language learners, since they are evaluating the meaning and searching for the correct way of representing their thoughts that come to mind in their L1. They inhabit in a permanent interlanguage state. We also chose this model because of how it describes the problem spaces. The rhetorical problems are all the circumstances which bring the composition of writing into existence. As stated by Bitzer, it includes the writer's topic, audience, and the goals or objectives the writer has. We believe that the social-cognitive model is more representative of the reality involving L2 learners, since it takes into consideration the problem translation with rhetorical and content problems, which make reference to the background of the writer.
In the following slide, we propose a few changes to the knowledge transforming model in order to apply it for explaining the particularities that L2 writing composing process implies in light of Matsuda and Highland wax. By adding a double overlap discourse knowledge and rhetorical problem space that tries to emulate a fusion of Matsuda dynamic model to Breiter and Scartemalia knowledge transforming rhetorical component, we establish a modification that illustrates how the interaction of writer and reader's backgrounds creates a shared discourse community which ESL written text is surrounded by. As the knowledge telling model is embedded in the knowledge transforming model, all of their composing, pre-writing, writing, reviewing, and cognitive processes, long-term memory from the telling model, problem solving from the knowledge transforming, and decision making from the dynamic model are included. Therefore, we complement the L1 writing composition process by adding feedback and explaining the merge between the reader and writer background, which would be the shared discourse community proposed by Matsuda in 1997, and how this aspect influences the understanding and protection of second language written text. As stated by Matsuda, the interaction of the differing backgrounds not only constructs the shared discourse community, but also transforms the writers' and readers' backgrounds. The dynamic model is a tool made to help define the relationship between the text and the context, and how there is a negotiation of meaning between the writer and reader. Depending on the context, what is said can be interpreted in different ways, which is why there is an importance in having a shared discourse community that relates the background of both participants in the exchange. The whole process is recursive, since it depends on repetition and revelation, the simultaneous bidirectionality and interaction among its stages, phases, processes. Furthermore, these also include both Matsuda static model factors, such as linguistic, cultural, and education, and dynamic model factors regarding socioeconomic status, religion affiliation, experience in writing specific genres, dialect, reader expectations, or the membership to an L1 or L2 discourse community. Some of these factors are also included in light of Highland work. In the same way, Highland factors include an expanded traditional explanations for both the static and dynamic Matsuda's models, and they are included as modifiers that affect simultaneously and recursively, bidirectionally, a writer reader's backgrounds, discourse knowledge, rhetorical problem space, and ESL written text composing process, especially in terms of revising. Which are these factors? In broad terms, they can be grouped in terms of competences as grammatical, discourse, sociolinguistic, and strategic competence, and other dimensions such as individual differences, different conceptions of knowledge, language proficiency, strategy, learning and teaching expectations, rhetorical differences, and especially cultural differences in terms of experiences, expectations, and backgrounds. Thus, we raise awareness about how an exclusive emphasis on psychological factors in writing does not necessarily provide a whole picture for L2 writing composition, either theoretically or pedagogically. Process approaches, as the Flower and Hayes model, overemphasize the cognitive relationship between the writer and their internal world, and as a result, they fail to offer a complete view on the social nature of writing or on the role of discourse and text structure in effective written communication. That's why we choose this knowledge transforming model as a starting point. Forces outside the individual that guide the writer to define problems, frame solutions, and shape the text also need to be considered. That's why we consider that by choosing the knowledge transforming and by complementing it with Matsuda and Highland ideas, a more plausible image would be illuminating each orientation and aspects of writing, keeping in mind that the process of writing is a rich amalgam of elements of which cognition is only one.
Here, you can see different individual factors that will potentially influence L2 acquisition. We have different factors proposed by Altman, Scahan, and Larson, Freeman, and Long. These are the people who Highland based his work on. And we can see very many different factors such as age, motivation and attitude, cognitive and affective factors, personality factors, among many more.
This table provides some specific aspects that L2 writers face in composing. The more relevant points are that L2 writers tend to plan less than L1 writers and produce shorter texts. They have more difficulty setting goals and generating material, revise more but reflect less on their writing, and they are less fluent and produce less accurate and effective texts.
Now, we will be answering one of the most important questions. How can teachers enhance writing competence in L2 learners? Well, according to Matsuda's peer feedback activities, students must learn how to negotiate the context of writing by learning through the experiences of the process. In order for this to happen, the different writing assignments need to be placed in real context that involve their particular discourse community and real readers that surround them. Writing assignments such as asking students to write a review on another classmate's essay and afterwards sharing it with the whole class, including the original author of that essay, will allow the writer to see how the intended reader reacts to his or her body of work and can also compare him or herself to the other people completing the task. Evaluation of organization includes the consideration of the possible reactions the intended reader might have. The teacher could also consider how the writer of the review incorporates different aspects from the author of the essay, such as the responses, in his own revision of the review. By taking into consideration the context the student intended to write in, the teacher can make an accurate evaluation of the effectiveness of the organizational structure of L2 text negotiating the context. The study of organization in written discourse has been and will continue to be an important part of L2 writing research. Because textual organization is one of the areas in which ESL students have most difficulties, it needs to be taught in ESL writing classrooms, but it needs to be taught in ways that are informed by an appropriate theory of L2 writing.
This table is a very useful summary that illustrates a clear and broad overview of the applications for instructional purposes that our proposal take into account regarding the different dimensions that may be considered in teaching writing as a complex process by accounting for Highland work, a genre pedagogy, as the previous discourse genre course or taught us last semester, that reinforce writing as a socio-cognitive process would be very assertive to implement, harmonizing it with the addition of other pertinent orientations or dimensions that this table includes, especially regarding some cultural differences that Highland exemplifies. Highland comments that educational processes in Western contexts tend to reinforce an analytical stance to knowledge, encouraging students to criticize existing sources, to dispute traditional wisdom, and form their own points of view. In writing classes, students are often asked to rework the ideas through recursive redrafting. Thus, Berater and Scardemalia characterize mature writing as knowledge transforming, where writers actively seek to elaborate and refine available knowledge. On the other hand, many Asian cultures, however, have a very different perspective that favors conserving and reproducing existing knowledge, establishing reverence for what is known through strategies such as memorization and imitation. Both these strategies demonstrate respect for knowledge, but may seem to the writing teacher as plagiarism. In Brader and Scardemalia terms, it is knowledge telling, which represents immature writing, where the writer's goal is simply to say what he or she can remember. So, by ignoring cultural consideration, teachers may see this as plagiarism or repetition and be misled into recasting such respect for knowledge as a developmental continuum from immaturity to maturity. Thus, by taking into account the other factors that we added to our proposal at Matsuda Dynamic Model propose, as in addition to the cultural differences like this one that highlight comments, writing teaching may be more conscious of how these rhetorical factors affect composition and cognitive processes.
In regard to psychological plausibility, Breiter and Scardamalia ask themselves, are the models compatible to the subjective experience people go through in writing a text? Is there any plausible information to how cognitive structures described by the models can be acquired? In relation to psychological reality, a model should be a mirror-like image of the whole process. It may be impossible for these models because they leave many characteristics of the complexity of the actual phenomenon behind for the sake of brevity. Regarding plausibility, it seems that all the models might be psychologically plausible to a certain extent, with Bateman Scardamaia's proposal being more connected to teaching applications. The psychological plausibility of the two models is addressed by the analysis of subjective accounts of the composing process and by an account of the way the cognitive structures described by the models. Now, in regard to parsimony, as pembered and reflected, a model may be, at the same time, a useful simplification of complex phenomena and a reductionist misrepresentation. In this sense, Breiter and Scardamani's knowledge transforming model attempts to explain writing composition with such simplicity and parsimony that some dynamic rhetorical factors, as the ones posited by Matsuda, shared discourse community, and reader-writer interaction, are left overlooked.
To conclude, the need to modify a L1 writing model as the one we choose, the knowledge transforming model, for L2 writing environments is restated, especially in regard to the interaction of writer reader background, their shared discourse community proposed by Matsuda, and individual strategic, cultural, rhetorical differences proposed by Highland. They emphasize the bidirectionality of the interaction among the recursive elements and take into account for composing components, for example, redrafting for knowledge transforming model, and cognitive components, decision making for Matsuda paragraph pattern approach. Peer feedback activities, by dynamically promoting composing processes such as redrafting and revising, influencing cognitive processes, illustrate how non-cognitive rhetorical factors affects L2 composition writing as a complex process. Although reductionist per definition, Brader and Scardamalia model fulfills its purpose to formulate a representation of writing processes, despite some complexities may be simplified, especially in terms of psychological plausibility, parsimony, and teaching design. All in all, both Brader and Scardamalia model and our proposal model are attempting to describe a complex multi-layered phenomenon with simultaneous events operation occurring that varies among individuals, communities, and societies. Finally, it's essential to remark that there are no better definitions. Each model complements each other in a way that enriches the understanding of the matter.
Thank you for listening, and we hope we have deepened your understanding of these models and the proposal we have done to transform the knowledge transforming model into a model applicable for L2 learners. Thank you very much.